John Calvin. What is the truth? John Calvin lived in the city of Noyon in the country of France over 500 years ago. He had a father and several brothers, but his mother had died when he was just a young boy. John was clever and loved to read. He longed to go to school. He knew that if he got a good education, it would mean great things for his life. His father encouraged him to do his best and work hard. John Calvin was clever and loved to read. When John went to school, he got a special haircut called a tonsure. It was strange at first, but all the other boys looked the same. They wore the same clothes, too. John learned his lessons well. His best friends were both from rich families, and they let John study at their homes. So it wasn't long before John was doing very well at school. His father was delighted. When John went to school, he got a special haircut. On his way to school, John could hear bells ringing. The cathedral was very near his home. When he peered up into the sky, he could see large, strong walls surrounding the streets and buildings. The cathedral bells were there to tell people to come and worship God. The walls of the city were to protect the people from enemy attack. John could hear bells ringing. But the real danger was that John didn't know the truth about God. John's priest told him that you could get to heaven by being good or by paying money to the church. This wasn't true. Nobody is good enough to get into heaven. Nobody can buy a place there. Jesus Christ is the only way to heaven. Well, the only real way to heaven. He is the only one good enough to pay the price that is needed. When Jesus died on the cross, he did all of the requirements to forgive sinners and obtain everlasting life for them. John, however, didn't know that. John didn't know the truth about God. One day, John saddled his horse and set off for university. It was sad that even though he was very clever, he didn't know what to do about the wrong things he had done. He didn't know what to do about his sins. However, when he arrived in Paris, John read what Martin Luther had written. John then realized that to have peace with God, you had to trust in God's Son, Jesus. God the Father had sent his one and only Son to save sinners. Those sinners who believed in Jesus Christ, God's Son, would be forgiven for their sins and have everlasting life. John read what Martin Luther had written. John had always been taught that you had to pay to Mary and the saints for forgiveness, but this wasn't true. When he met other people who had been forgiven, John realized that he could pray to God directly. It was an exciting time for John as he discovered all these truths. However, many reformers like John were being thrown into prison, so it was a dangerous time too. John realized that he could pray to God directly. John Calvin also started to read the Bible. He had seen Bibles before in cathedrals, but they were read by priests, usually, and not by ordinary people. That was because the Bible was written in a language that very few people understood. The priests didn't want people reading it for themselves. When John read the Bible for himself, he began to realize what an important book it was. John Calvin also started to read the Bible. It didn't take long for John to realize that the priests had been lying to them. He trusted in Jesus Christ to save him from his sins and started to tell others the truth that they hadn't heard. John traveled far and wide. Many people didn't like what he said, but John was saying it was true. John was true. It was the church that had been wrong. John traveled far and wide. John had to run away to another country. His enemies wanted to put him in prison. Eventually, he arrived in Geneva, where he hoped to be able to teach the truth in safety. But John had enemies there too. However, there was one person in Geneva who loved him and looked after him. His wife, Adelette. When Adelette's first husband died, she was left on her own with her 2 children. But eventually, Adelette and John Calvin became husband and wife. John was thankful to God for his new family. Many other people who lived in Geneva at that time knew that John Calvin was preaching the truth, so they listened eagerly to all that he had to say. John had to run away to another country. God helped John Calvin to teach the truth. He was one of the men who started what we now call the Reformation. Men and women who listened to John's preachings decided that they had to tell others too. John helped them go to other countries to teach the truth about God. Some even traveled thousands of miles across oceans. A new church had begun, a Reformed church. God helped John Calvin teach the truth. John Calvin died in Geneva, but nobody knows for sure where he is buried. However, people today remember John Calvin because of the truth that he taught. John taught the truth so that we can learn it, believe it, and live by it. We must thank God for the men and women of the Reformation who believed in him and spread the truth across the world. People today remember John Calvin because of the truth he taught. The end. Bye.